In 1920, Akron was the fastest growing city in American history, faster than Detroit and faster than Los Angeles. Its population exploded from 69,000 in 1910 to 208,000 by 1920, a 200% increase in a single decade. The city produced the rubber that put America on wheels, including tires, hoses, gas masks, life rafts, and blimps. Today, the four companies that built Akron, Goodyear, Firestone, Goodrich, and General Tire have either left, been sold to foreign owners, or vanished entirely. Population fell from a peak of 290,000 in 1960 to under 190,000 today. So how did four corporations build and then destroy an entire American city? Akron's ascent began with its place atop the Ohio and Erie Canal, a 309-mile waterway finished in 1827. At 1,160 feet above sea level, the city sat at the canal summit, where engineers managed a 15-foot hydraulic head using a series of locks and races. This setup delivered about 1.2 million gallons of water each day, enough to power early grist mills, then steam engines, and eventually the huge vats that defined the rubber industry. The 7-lock Cascade, anchored by the Cascade Race, created a steady reservoir that factories could count on year-round, sparing Akron from the droughts and shortages that often crippled other towns. Freight costs sealed Akron's advantage. In 1835, shipping on the canal cost just 2 cents per ton-mile, less than half the price of wagon transport. Board of Trade records from the era show nearly 15,000 tons of grain, timber, and coal passing through Akron's locks each year. Outbound flour and oatmeal supplied Cleveland's bakeries and New York's markets, while the canal's rate structure slashed expenses for local producers and opened distant markets. By the 1850s, secondary industries like the Akron Clay Pipe Company and Oatmeal Mill had sprung up, relying on cheap bulk shipping to reach buyers far beyond Ohio. The canal's economics built a commercial base that could adapt and grow. When the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad arrived in the 1870s, Akron's logistical edge only sharpened. Rail lines ran parallel to the canal, with interchange yards at South Main and North Side, letting manufacturers switch between water and rail depending on season or urgency. By the 1880s, more than 65% of raw rubber and 70% of outbound coal moved through these junctions, cutting delivery times from 15 days by canal alone to as little as 6 days with rail. This redundancy, canal for bulk, rail for speed, shielded Akron's industries from delays and drew new investment. Water powered more than transport. The Cascade Race delivered mechanical energy to mills and later cooled rubber plants. When Dr. Benjamin Franklin Goodrich moved his operation from New York in 1870, he cited the city's abundant water, stable canal rates, and rail access as decisive. By the early 20th century, factories clustered within a half-mile of the summit locks, cementing Akron's reputation as a magnet for heavy industry. In the summer of 1870, Benjamin Franklin Goodrich arrived in Akron with a proposition that would set the tone for the city's next century. Goodrich, a physician-turned-industrialist from New York, was looking for more than just water and rail connections. He wanted a guarantee, a sign that Akron's leaders would share the risks of building a new kind of factory in the Midwest. The city's Board of Trade answered with an offer of $13,600, a sum that covered land, water rights from the Cascade Race, and startup costs for his rubber works. Board minutes from June 1870 record the deal in precise terms: 2 acres near the canal, exclusive access to the hydraulic flow, and a cash advance to secure machinery and labor. For a town with fewer than 10,000 residents, the grant was a gamble. At the time, $13,600 represented nearly half the city's annual discretionary budget. But the Board of Trade saw in Goodrich's proposal a way to convert Akron's Canal Summit from a grain milling outpost into a magnet for heavy industry. The incentive package was more than a handshake. It was a formal contract, with city councilmen and local bankers pledging their own credit to back the venture. Goodrich's first plant, built at 101 East Market Street, stood just 200 feet from the canal's eastern lock, with a direct water-wheel drive for the vulcanization vats. The precedent was immediate and unmistakable. Within a decade, Akron city leaders would replicate the Goodrich deal for other industrialists. Frank Seiberling, who would later found Goodyear, secured a similarly structured incentive in 1898. Harvey Firestone's arrival in 1900 brought an even larger municipal outlay. But it was Goodrich who set the template, a public-private partnership rooted in cash, land, and infrastructure, each side betting on the other's success. The $13,600 grant did more than lure a single company. It institutionalized a civic strategy that lowered the barriers for every capital-intensive manufacturer that followed. City records show that after Goodrich, the Board of Trade began holding regular sessions to review industrial petitions, each time weighing the risks of subsidy against the promise of payrolls and tax receipts. The logic was simple. If Akron could offer what no other city would, upfront capital, water, and rail, it could outcompete larger rivals and tie its fortunes to the new industrial age. By the turn of the century, this approach had transformed Akron's economic DNA. The city's willingness to invest public funds in private enterprise drew not just rubber companies, but also steel, chemical, and machinery firms. The original Goodrich grant became a local legend, cited in council debates and business prospectuses as proof that Akron was open for business. What began as a $13,600 bargain became the model for a city that would soon be known as the rubber capital of the world. Frank A. Seiberling entered Akron's industrial story in 1898 with a $13,500 stake, $3,500 borrowed from his brother-in-law, and the rest scraped together from local investors and city incentives. But Seiberling's ambitions stretched far beyond factory walls. He believed that a company's reach should extend into the daily lives of its workers, shaping not only their paychecks, but their neighborhoods, homes, and even their sense of belonging. Goodyear Heights, conceived in the 1910s and built out over the next 2 decades, became the physical expression of that belief. The plan called for roughly 1,300 modest houses spread across 10 square miles on Akron's east side. Each lot measured 40 feet across, with a small front yard and a street lamp at the curb. The grid was designed for efficiency, but also for dignity. No tenements, no barracks, just single-family homes with porches and gardens. Seiberling's planners included schools, parks, and even a community hall, all financed through a mix of company loans and municipal bonds. Property deeds and mortgage records from Summit County show that most homes were sold to workers at below-market rates, with payments deducted directly from weekly wages. City planning maps and subdivision plats from 1914 to 1916 reveal a deliberate effort to keep the development integrated with factory rail spurs so that workers could walk from their front doors to the Goodyear plant in less than 15 minutes. At the other end of the social spectrum, Seiberling built Stan Hewitt Hall, a Tudor Revival mansion spanning 300 feet, completed in 1915 at a cost of $3 million. The estate ledgers, preserved in the Stan Hewitt archives, detail expenditures for imported leaded glass, hand-carved timber, and Olmsted-designed gardens. The mansion construction invoices and family correspondence capture a world of privilege that stood in stark contrast to the worker cottages of Goodyear Heights, yet both were linked by the same flow of capital and the same vision of corporate stewardship. Stan Highwit was not just a private home but a symbol of Akron's new elite, a statement that industry could bring not only jobs, but culture and refinement to a city once known only for grain mills and canal locks. Sieberling's approach set a precedent for how corporations could shape the urban landscape. By 1930, company-built housing and executive estates had become fixtures of Akron's social geography. The boundaries between work and home blurred, and the city itself became a kind of living ledger, recording the ambitions and anxieties of its industrial patrons. For a time, the arrangement worked. Stable housing underpinned labor peace, and the promise of home ownership kept workers tethered to the factories that paid their wages. But the same structures that bound the city together would later reveal their vulnerabilities as economic tides shifted and corporate priorities changed. Harvey Firestone arrived in Akron in 1900, drawn by the same promise of public and private partnership that had brought Goodrich and Sieberling before him. This time, the city's offer was even bolder, a package worth $45,000, the largest yet, which combined cash, land, and utility concessions. Board of Trade records from that year detail the arrangement, including city-owned lots along South Main Street, discounted rates for water and electricity, and a direct rail spur to the new plant's loading docks. The sum, equivalent to more than $1 million today, reflected both Akron's growing ambition and the escalating competition among American cities to attract big industry. Firestone's own correspondence, preserved in the company's early files, describes the deal as a mutual wager, with the city betting on jobs and payrolls, and Firestone pledging to build not just a factory, but a supply chain that would tie Akron to Detroit's automakers and the national highway boom. Construction began within months. The first Firestone plant sprawled across 100 acres, with production lines engineered for scale, hundreds of workers at a time, each shift feeding the insatiable demand for Model T tires. By 1908, Henry Ford was fitting Firestone tires as standard equipment on every new car rolling off his Highland Park assembly line. The South Main complex grew into a small city of its own, with housing, cafeterias, and a company store, its smokestacks visible for miles. Internal memos from Firestone's archives show early plans for a rubber estate in Brazil, a hedge against supply shocks that would later define the industry's global reach. 15 years later, Akron's fourth pillar took shape. In 1915, William O'Neill launched General Tire and Rubber, capitalizing on a fresh round of city incentives. The precise terms of General Tire's property tax abatement remain lost to the public record, but city council minutes and contemporary news accounts confirm that a multi-year tax concession enabled O'Neill to acquire a vast tract on the city's southern edge. Incorporation files from that year list the new plant's address and note the abatement as a material consideration. Within 5 years, General Tire's workforce topped 2,000, producing not only tires, but also conveyor belts and industrial hoses for a nation still laying its infrastructure. The arrival of Firestone and General Tire completed Akron's industrial architecture. 4 companies, each anchored by civic incentives and logistical advantage, now formed a tightly linked ecosystem. Their factories clustered along the canal and rail lines, feeding off the same labor pool, suppliers, and municipal services. The city's fortunes rose with the company's output, and for a generation, it seemed as if Akron's civic gamble would pay dividends without end. The scale of these early deals, $45,000 for Firestone and a substantial but undocumented tax break for General Tire, set the city apart, binding its destiny to the tire industry's relentless expansion and the unpredictable tides of American manufacturing. By the 1920s, Akron's rubber industry had become an engine of mass production on a scale few American cities could match. Company payroll ledgers from the era record more than 70,000 workers on the rolls of just 4 firms: B.F. Goodrich, Goodyear, Firestone, and General Tire. At their height, These companies produced over half of all rubber goods manufactured in the United States. Goodrich alone employed 30,000 people, its payrolls stretching across 3 shifts and multiple plants that lined the banks of the Little Cuyahoga. Firestone's South Main complex counted 23,000 employees at its peak, while General Tire's Summit Hill plant listed 12,000 on its rosters. The numbers were staggering for a city whose population had not reached 300,000. Production ledgers from the mid-1920s show a relentless pace. Goodrich's Little Cuyahoga plant turned out 150,000 tires per month, accounting for nearly 40% of the nation's pneumatic tire market by 1930. Firestone's continuous flow vulcanization lines, a technical innovation introduced in the 1930s, processed up to 250,000 tires each day. General Tire, though smaller, specialized in conveyor belts and industrial hoses, feeding the infrastructure boom that swept across the country. The combined output of these plants supplied not only Detroit's assembly lines, but also the nation's railroads, mines, and construction sites. The city's workforce was as diverse as it was vast. Migrants from Appalachia, African Americans from the Deep South, and European immigrants all found steady work on the factory floor. Payroll rosters from 1925 list surnames from Kentucky, West Virginia, Poland, and Italy, each name a story of migration in search of industrial wages. The labor force was young, too. Census data from 1930 show that nearly 1 in 3 Akron residents was under 25, drawn by the promise of a job and a weekly paycheck. Aggregate employment records reveal the city's dependence on rubber. By 1955, more than 70,000 Akronites, almost 1 in 2 working adults, drew their living from the industry. The city's tax receipts, school enrollments, and even its housing stock all reflected the rhythms of the factory whistle. For decades, Akron's prosperity was measured by the volume of tires shipped and the size of the weekly payroll. The magnitude of this industrial ecosystem set the stage for both the city's greatest achievements and its deepest vulnerabilities, as the fortunes of tens of thousands became tied to the relentless demands of mass output. In 1908, B.F. Goodrich engineers filed a patent for a tire tread that would change American travel. Their design, interlocking blocks and grooves, was shaped by the rough winters of Ohio, built to grip muddy ruts and icy roads, and tough enough to survive the freeze-thaw cycles that cracked city streets. Patent records from that year show a geometry deep enough to shed snow, a pattern that made the tire more than just a product. It became a symbol of Akron's promise to lead a nation on wheels. By 1912, the Little Cuyahoga plant was producing 150,000 of these tires each month, and the city's factories became synonymous with progress and reliability. Akron's ambitions didn't stop at the ground. By the late 1920s, Goodyear's research department, led by Carl Arnstein, set its sights on the sky. Engineers drafted blueprints for a structure that defied precedent. A building vast enough to shelter an entire airship, yet strong enough to withstand the fierce storms of the Midwest. The result was the Goodyear Air Dock, completed in 1929. At 1,175 feet long and 211 feet high, it was the largest building in the world, without internal supports. Its steel ribs arched over more than 4 million cubic feet of open space, so immense that clouds sometimes formed inside on humid days. Construction records list over 4,000 tons of steel and concrete walls 15 feet thick, all completed for $5 million, a staggering sum at the time. Within the air dock, Goodyear assembled the USS Akron and USS Macon, the largest rigid airships ever built in America. The hangar's silhouette dominated the city's skyline, its doors wide enough to release a vessel the size of an aircraft carrier. For workers and executives, the air dock was more than a building. It was proof that Akron could meet any challenge on land or in the air. The city's newspapers celebrated each breakthrough, and R&D labs worked day and night, filing patents that kept Akron at the forefront of American industry. In these years, as the AR dock rose and the all-weather tread conquered the roads, Akron stood at the height of its confidence, certain that its best days were still to come. On February 14, 1936, the air inside Goodyear's Plant 2 filled with a new kind of tension. Instead of walking out, 14,000 workers sat down at their machines and refused to move. For 35 days, production lines ground to a halt, but the factory floor remained crowded. Men and women reading newspapers, playing cards, organizing meetings, and waiting for word from the outside. This was not the first strike in Akron, but it was the first time the rank and file seized the plant itself, holding the machinery hostage and daring management to try to remove them by force. The sit-down strike had no single architect. Its leaders were drawn from the shop committees and the newly formed United Rubber Workers, a union that only months earlier had struggled to win recognition. They coordinated shifts, kept order, and negotiated with company guards at the doors. Minutes from union meetings record demands for a 15% wage increase, a 40-hour work week, and formal recognition of the union as the bargaining agent for all rubber workers. The city's newspapers, especially the Akron Beacon-Journal, published daily updates, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes hostile, always aware that the city's entire economy hung in the balance. As the days dragged on, Goodyear's management appealed to the courts and the governor for help. Judge Samuel H. Doyle issued an injunction ordering the strikers to vacate the plant. Governor Martin Davey mobilized the National Guard, but stopped short of sending troops inside. Outside, thousands of supporters gathered on the streets, bringing food and supplies to the occupied factory. Inside, the strikers held firm, refusing to be provoked or intimidated. The union's discipline became legend, a rule against drinking, a nightly roll call, and a system of internal policing that kept the peace among thousands of anxious men. After 5 weeks, with inventories dwindling and pressure mounting from Detroit automakers, Goodyear executives agreed to negotiate. On March 21, 1936, the company recognized the United Rubber Workers and granted modest wage and hour concessions. The sit-down ended not with a dramatic confrontation but with a handshake and a return to work. The factory occupation had lasted 35 days. For the first time, labor had forced one of Akron's giants to the table, demonstrating that the balance of power in the city's factories had shifted. The United Rubber Workers would become a permanent fixture in Akron's industrial life, and the memory of the sit-down would echo in every contract negotiation for decades to come. In 1965, a quiet revolution arrived from across the Atlantic. Michelin introduced the radial tire to American markets, a design that rendered decades of Akron's engineering obsolete almost overnight. Unlike the familiar bias ply, with cords laid at angles, the radial's steel belts ran perpendicular to the tread, offering twice the mileage and sharper handling. For Akron's 4 giants, B.F. Goodrich, Goodyear, Firestone, and General Tire, the challenge was not just technical, but financial. Retooling a single factory for radial production demanded a capital outlay of $12 million. Internal budgets from that year show plant engineers poring over conversion plans, calculating the cost of new bead lockers, automated tread winders, and specialized curing presses. In the West Akron plant, the first pilot line conversion swallowed the entire year's equipment budget. Engineers faced a wrenching choice: retrofit aging bias ply lines or risk falling behind, as Detroit's automakers began demanding radials for every new car. The numbers told a grim story. By 1967, General Tire managed a partial conversion, buoyed by a state incentive, but both Firestone and Goodrich hesitated, wary of sinking millions into unproven machinery. Goodyear's board debated whether to commit to full-scale retooling or focus on incremental upgrades. Each $12 million investment represented not just a bet on new technology, but a direct threat to the jobs of skilled workers whose expertise lay in bias ply construction. As engineers scrambled to adapt, the financial strain mounted. Company ledgers from 1965 to 1970 show ballooning capital expenditures with little immediate return. The old production lines, once the backbone of Akron's prosperity, now stood as costly reminders of a city locked into yesterday's technology. The radial revolution was more than a technical leap. It was a reckoning for an entire industrial system built on the promise that the future would always look like the past. The spring of 1976 brought a grinding halt to Akron's factories. On March 5th, contract talks between the United Rubber Workers and the city's 4 major tire makers collapsed. By day's end, more than 12,000 union members had walked off the job, shutting down Goodyear's West Plant, Firestone's South Main Complex, Goodrich's Little Cuyahoga facility, and General Tire's Summit Hill line. As the days wore on, the number of striking workers swelled to nearly 14,000, including smaller plants and support staff. For 130 days, nearly 4.5 months, Akron's assembly lines fell silent. Conveyor belts idled, and the city's industrial heart went cold. The demands were blunt. A 6% wage increase, a $2 per hour cost of living adjustment, and above all, a guarantee that jobs would not vanish as the companies scrambled to cut costs. Healthcare security became a flashpoint, and union negotiators pressed for a freeze on premium hikes, fearing that rising medical bills would erode even the largest pay raises. Company negotiators, led by Goodyear's Herald Day, countered with warnings of shrinking margins, pointing to foreign competition and the ballooning costs of retooling for radial tires. Internal memos from the period show executives calculating the financial hit. Each week of the strike cost the 4 companies nearly $5 million in lost output. By July 13th, the standoff ended with a tentative agreement. The union accepted a partial wage boost and modest healthcare concessions, but the coveted no-layoff clause never materialized. Within a year, Goodyear announced the closure of its truck and bus line, and Firestone began winding down its historic South Main operation. The strike's price tag of $620 million, over $3 billion today, accelerated the unraveling of Akron's industrial base. What began as a fight for security left the city more exposed than ever, as the cost of labor peace became another factor in the spiral of closures and job loss that followed. By the late 1970s, the cost of technological change and global competition collided with the lives of tens of thousands in Akron. Between 1978 and 1982, more than 35,000 rubber industry jobs disappeared from the city, an exodus that left entire neighborhoods hollowed out almost overnight. Payroll ledgers and Labor Department statistics tell the scale. Akron's unemployment rate soared to 14%, one of the highest in the nation. The last passenger car tire rolled off a Goodyear line in 1978, a quiet milestone that went largely unremarked in the city's official records, but was felt in every kitchen and union hall. Laid-off workers gathered outside factory gates, clutching severance checks and pink slips. Some had spent decades on the same line, building tires by hand or tending the presses that once ran around the clock. Their skills, once the backbone of Akron's prosperity, now seemed to have no place in the new economy. Local newspapers chronicled stories of families packing up for Texas or North Carolina, chasing rumors of work in distant plants. School enrollments dropped, corner stores closed, and the rhythm of daily life slowed to a crawl. Goodyear Heights, Firestone Park, and the streets around the old General Tire complex saw vacancy rates spike as houses went on the market for a fraction of their former value. The numbers only tell part of the story. Behind every lost job was a household forced to make impossible choices between groceries and mortgage payments, between staying put and starting over somewhere else. For many, the loss was not just financial, but personal. a rupture in the social fabric that had bound the city together for nearly a century. The shock of those years set the stage for the next chapter: the retreat of corporate ownership and the unraveling of the industrial order that had once made Akron the envy of the Midwest. In 1986, the boardroom at Goodyear's filled with tension as executives faced a threat that had nothing to do with rubber or tires. A corporate raider, James Goldsmith, had quietly amassed shares and was preparing a hostile takeover. To defend itself, Goodyear's directors authorized a $2.6 billion debt-financed buyback, an unprecedented sum borrowed at high interest rates, just to keep the company under local control. Securities and Exchange Commission filings from that year detail the maneuver. More than $2 billion in new bonds issued in a matter of weeks, with the company's own plants and cash flow pledged as collateral. The cost of this defense would ripple outward, forcing asset sales, plant closures, and a freeze on new investment in Akron. The turbulence did not stop with Goodyear. Just 4 years earlier, General Tire's parent GenCorp had sold off its tire division to focus on aerospace and chemicals. The 1982 sale, recorded in the company's annual report, spelled the end of General Tire's passenger tire production in Akron. By 1986, B.F. Goodrich followed, announcing its exit from the tire business after more than a century. Corporate filings show the company divested its last rubber assets and began shifting headquarters staff out of the city, severing the direct link between the boardroom and the neighborhoods where generations had worked. In 1988, Firestone, already weakened by years of losses, was bought outright by Bridgestone, a Japanese conglomerate, for $2.6 billion. Securities and Exchange Commission documents from the acquisition list the assets, liabilities, and remaining U.S. operations, but the decisions were made far from Akron. Headquarters functions moved to Nashville, and the South Main plant, once the city's largest employer, was shuttered and later demolished. Local control, once taken for granted, evaporated as decisions about jobs, investment, and even the fate of historic buildings shifted to distant investors and multinational boards. The city that had once shaped the destinies of 4 global companies now found its own future decided by balance sheets and board votes conducted in New York, Tokyo, and Charlotte. The consequences would soon fall on City Hall as it scrambled to keep the last corporate headquarters from leaving town. In 2013, City Council convened behind closed doors to approve $160 million in incentives for Goodyear, a blend of tax abatements, infrastructure upgrades, and direct grants designed to keep the company's global headquarters in Akron. Public records show the deal included $20 million in cash incentives and years of property tax relief, all justified as a lifeline for 1,200 remaining white-collar jobs. The new headquarters rose on East Market Street, a glass and steel complex standing in sharp contrast to the shuttered plants and empty lots that surround it. Across the street, the original Goodyear factory sits idle, its brick walls streaked with rust, an emblem of what was once the city's beating heart. Council minutes reveal a city divided. Supporters argued the incentive was necessary to prevent Akron from losing its last Fortune 500 nameplate. Dissenters questioned whether public money could ever buy back the decades of vanished payrolls. In the decades since, census data show the city's median household income remains 30% below the national average. The tax base has shrunk by 38% since 1970, leaving fewer resources for schools, roads, and basic services. The Mayflower Hotel, once a downtown landmark, now stands mostly empty, its promised redevelopment delayed by funding gaps and legal disputes. City officials defend the Goodyear deal as a pragmatic response to a shrinking economy, but the numbers paint a different picture. Akron's population has fallen to under 190,000, and the income gap continues to widen. For every gleaming new office, there are blocks of boarded-up storefronts and neighborhoods where vacant lots outnumber occupied homes. The bargain struck to save one corporate headquarters has become a symbol, a reminder of how much the city has given and how little it has received in return. The debate over incentives lingers, unresolved, as Akron searches for a future beyond the shadow of its industrial past. Akron's skyline still bears the names of vanished empires: Goodrich, Firestone, Goodyear, etched into brick and smokestack. Today, the city's population stands at 188,701, with median incomes trailing the nation by nearly a third. The lesson remains stark. When a city's fate is tied to the ambitions of 4 boardrooms, the cost of corporate retreat is measured in emptied neighborhoods and generational loss. Industrial triumph can vanish, but its consequences do not.